some good weather if we are. Anyway, you can't make this stuff up, can you? This is a member of Congress.
That isn't saying much, I
Don't you
think.
really like that? So one thing that's just is unlimited is human stupidity, right? There's just whatever, no matter how stupid you are, you can be confident that there's somebody who's a lot stupider than you are. And that's true all the way down at just bottom us. It's the one infinite thing that we know about. I want to remind you of the plot. It's we'll see how it thickens, but here's roughly the plot, right? So the question that I asked you to write about in looking at these films is, well, what does love target? When people say things like they want to be loved for themselves, or when the gospel tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves, what's going on? How should we understand that? And in a way, that's a question like this one. You know, what are we really? How should we think about what we are? And one of the things that you can see happening in different vocabularies, different ways of expressing essentially the same idea, is that we are somehow a complex of things. On one version of the story, it's roughly speaking this. A big chunk of us is kind of our animal nature. It comes out of nature. It's like what the blue-footed boobies have, just like that. But there's something else that's not like that. Something that is either mysteriously comes from somewhere else, or in any case is something that the blue-footed boobies don't have. And that's usually thought of as our rational nature. So we could think this, right? So think of Aristotle. 3 kinds of friends, right? There are the appetitive friends who are in it for pleasure. There are the ones who are in it for utility, right? And then there are the good ones, the best ones, and they're the virtue friends. And what are they out for? Well, they admire in one another, right? Some specific kind of thing that gets you right to the true self, what they really are. They're not friends via their appetites. They're not friends via their desire for money and so forth, or utility. They're friends via, well, what? Well, they're rational parts, right? They're the parts where the virtues hang out, so to speak. And you get the same story in different versions, right? Kant, we're not studying him, but I write about him a little bit in Love's Confusions. In Kant, there's the noumenal free self, and there's the phenomenal determined self, and ethics and value and all that good stuff are up there in the noumenal self. And so it's a real problem with something like marriage, right? Why? Well, marriage does, while it might be the marriage of true minds, also seems to be the intermingling of 2 bodies. And that worries Kant in a way that we would probably be very surprised about it. We haven't been reading a lot of Kant. But he sort of thinks, well, wait, that just means you want the other person as an instrument of your pleasure, or you want to, you're not seeing them as an end in themselves, but as a means to your ends. Well, that's bad. Or take Kierkegaard, right? Well, we're attracted by certain kinds of things we see in others. Love is ignited by whatever it is. It happens to ignite it. But that's not Christian love. That's not the love that we're enjoying to feel in the gospel. Rather, what we're enjoying to feel there, as Kant says, Kierkegaard says, God is always the middle term in the good kind of friendship. Why? Well, because what we love in each other is God reflected in us. Well, that's just another way of talking about the rational part, right? Because when God gets reflected in us, it's not the monstrous, often us, that gets reflected. It's rather the nice, good, rational. That's the thought. So notice that all these stories are essentially, when you boil them down, they're all the same story. They're all a story that says something like this. There's a good part of us and a bad part of us. The good part of us, when it forms friendships with the good part of others, or love relations with the good part of others, that's good. But when the bad part of us forms that nasty, meaty kind of relationship with another person, what results in tab A going into slot B or C or D or whatever, that's bad. That's an aspect of our boobiness, right? We're like animals. Ugh, that's awful. Right? And those nasty parts that we hide, bump into one another, that's not good. Right? What you really want is the purified, ethereal, right, rational. Okay, so that's really the picture. And in a sense, though it's, of course, not the whole of the history of philosophy, it's one big main highway from the beginning right up until the present day. So, we just take a few recent examples, right? One thought is, oh, now we've read a lot of Darwin. We know that we're the results of evolution. But there's something in us that we can't explain that way. We haven't been able to find the evolutionary route to, well, our consciousness, our conscious life. As yet, that remains unclear. We don't know how it is that this sort of very simple thing, that the world seems to us a certain way, that that things look red or green or blue to us, that there's a way things look, so to speak. We don't know how to explain that. How do you get that out of everything else? And so some people have argued, well, no, you have to put that in at the beginning. That can't emerge. It has to be there from the start. It has to be a primitive part of the world, whatever it is. And that's another way of sort of saying there's something rather special about us human beings, and that rather something special is separated off from these other aspects of us that are more like what we share with all the other animals. And you can see how deep that goes into our culture and our picture of ourselves, right? We find it very easy. When we see no animals allowed, we don't think it excludes us, right? We worry about the fact that we might be too much like those other animals, right? Too much like them, and that far more of what we do is set by our natures and is not sort of up to us and free and so forth. And the more we know about ourselves, we might just think about the criminal law and the way that we've increased the scope of the insanity defense or something like that, so that we think that far more things that we used to be to blame for, so to speak, or praised for, aren't under our control after all, at all, right? So that's a way to think. Are you kind of grooving along with this little bit of stuff? Okay. So what I want to do is just read this little bit of Aristotle about this, and then reflect on it a little bit. This is what we should have done last Wednesday, but I was on my way to Paris. I preferred to do that than to come. And this is 10.8. 9.8 on the Nicomachean Ethics. It's page 165 of this edition if you haven't had it. And you remember that we've looked at it before, but let's look at it again. There's also a puzzle about whether a person should love himself most or someone else. For people admonish those who like themselves most, calling them self-lovers, or as we would say, selfish, on the supposition that this is actually something shameful. It seems, too, that a base person does all his actions for the sake of himself, and the more depraved he is, the more he does so. People complain, therefore, that he does nothing away from himself, right? It's all directed towards his own benefit. A decent person, by contrast, say a virtuous person, that is, seems to act because of what's noble, and the better he is, the more he does so, and for the sake of a friend, disregarding his own interests. Those are the two polar positions, right? So one says, you need to be a lot more altruistic, or we're inclined to be selfish, right? The other, so that person says selfishness, being self-interest, that's bad. You need to be more altruistic, right? And Aristotle says, with these accounts, our results clash, which is not surprising, for the results say that we should love most the one who is most a friend, and the one who is most a friend is the one who wishes good things to the person who wishes them to, for the person's own sake, even if no one will know. But these features are found most in a person's relation to himself, as of course are all the others by which a friend is defined. We're most of all our own friends, and we become friends with others by extending the relationship we feel for ourselves, friendship we feel for ourselves to others, right? Love your neighbor as yourself tells you the same story, because it says, you already love yourself, so get on with extending that. You're your own best friend. And then the friend becomes, via that way of thinking, a second self, right? Another one that you feel the same kinds of loving feelings for that you feel for yourself. All the proverbs are of one mind about this as well. For example, one soul is we're of one mind, as we would say. And what friends have, they have in common. Equality is friendship, and me is closer than shin. Yeah.
Doesn't this run into the same problem, like illustrated with the Kierkegaard thing about the diner, like
Yeah.
the glasses,
Yeah.
and you're looking at them?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be the same thing? Is that like, oh, you're just
Here
doing
I
this-
am.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a little bit of that, right? Because the thought would be, right, just as if you were to say, oh no, I see myself in your glasses, or I see God reflected in you. The thought is, you know, I really love you because you're so much like me. You know, if only you were a wee bit more like me, I'd love you even more, right? Why? Well, because I love myself the most. And there's something, you know, I think what we want to do is think, how did we get to a position where we thought that was so obvious, right? That, in fact, even the gospel writer, who's not a philosopher, right, but and we often say to ourselves, you can't love somebody else unless you love yourself. You've got to, right? We take it for granted that we are self-interested, and that the problem is of extending our interests to others. So in a famous book by Geoffrey Warnock, written in the last century, the end of the last century, which seems like only yesterday, because it really wasn't that long ago, Warnock says the problem of ethics is the problem of limited sympathies, right? It's of how to extend your sympathies from the close, either you and your little group, to others, right? That's the idea, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, like going off that, I wonder, so
Yeah.
we talked about the third, like the third
Yeah.
term is the thing you relate to. Is the self the third term in this figuring? Like, because it's like if you say you have a relationship with yourself, there's already two terms, because there's like the awareness that has the relation
Yeah.
with something that stands apart.
Yeah.
So is that like this self becomes something that kind of migrates out of my...
Well, it's I mean, there's a thought, I think there are reflexive relations, right? Relations where the same thing stands on either side of the relation. Identity is one like that, right? There aren't two things. There's one that's identical to itself. So I think we could say, well, it's that kind of reflexive relation. But notice, though, that if we make love reflexive, so it just stands to you, then we have the trouble of two kinds of love, right? One that's this way and one that's that way. So another way to go would be, well, if love is directed, and then the question is, what is it directed to? And then Aristotle says, well, primarily it's first and foremost directed to you, but then it's directed to other things that are like you too, right? So then it gets extended in that sort of way. So you're right. What I want to get across, though, is this is actually what we all think. When we sort of start doing some of this thinking, we find ourselves going down these roads, and what we have to do is find a natural way to see what's wrong with going down the road. And that's very hard to do. We keep at it. So economics, for example, uses kind of ideas about self-interest to drive its whole way of thinking about human beings, as if self-interest is obvious and interest in others is not. Yeah.
Well, I think this might be what Aristotle's getting at in terms
Yeah.
of the ethics, is that like maybe you don't have that awareness about yourself at first.
Yeah.
Maybe you have a very good friend,
Yeah.
and then you see yourself in that friend,
Yeah.
and that awareness comes first.
Yeah. Well, so Aristotle has two parts, and you're right, there's a secondary one, which is one of the reasons you're interested in other people who are like you, is that they are mirrors of you. And more than that, because you've helped make them that way by living together with them and acting together with them, their actions are in a way yours too, and the way that the actions of a student might be directed back in a certain way to the teacher, right? That's the thought. You've seeded that something in them, so that there's this quite a dense relationship that friends have with each other. Not just reflection, but they're partly responsible for the likeness that they see in each other. Right? They kind of get to be like one another by acting and living together. Yes, so there's that too. But notice, of course, that just presupposes that you already like yourself. yourself, right? Otherwise, why would you like anybody that you see yourself reflected in, right? And but it's not just so you remember one of the worries we had about the gospel was, what if you don't love yourself, right? Then it's not a good idea to extend that self-hatred, right? But remember that Aristotle has a view about what really good self-love is. It's directed not to the ugly, pimply you, but to the beautiful, fair-skinned you, right? It's directed to the rational self, not to the rest of you. So the thought is, right, so when you start pushing on it, let's go to Kierkegaard, right? That's the obvious one. That's really clever. You know, God is not something else apart from our relations to each other that we love. It's rather that we love God reflected in each one of us. So the love of God and the love for each other are kind of the same love. Right? Hold that thought for a second. Then you ask this, well, don't we all end up being the same then? Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, right, isn't Mary and Jane and Bob and Frank, aren't they all just little mirrors of God, aren't they? So aren't we just loving one thing? Well, now look at Aristotle, right? What do you love? I love me. And what else do you love? Well, me reflected in other people. Yeah, you see how good I'm really? And I love everyone that reflects me. Now, that doesn't seem right. I mean, if you push it, we seem to lose what's essential, which is that love, so to speak, is an individualized relationship between concrete, specific individuals. It's not generalized, right? It's not one size fits all. It's not one thing. It's many different kinds of. So really what you love about your beloved, so to speak, is him or her in their particularity, right? They're not, it's not that you see them as examples of a kind, tokens of a type or whatever. You see them as unique. And that's one of the, let me show you how you can see that very quickly. So suppose, for example, that your beloved is found to have a fatal illness, right? So you go to the hospital with your beloved, and the news is very bad, right? A couple of days left to live. Then the doctor says, but there is something, we can't do anything for her, the beloved, okay? Can't do anything for the beloved, but we can do something for you. What's that? Well, you say, well, we can make you a cell-for-cell replica of your beloved. Exactly, you won't be able to tell the difference. If we did it secretly, you wouldn't even notice. This is like the Blade Runner case, right? Mm. So, you don't have to suffer anything at all, right? You come back in a couple of days, we'll give you a brand new Mary, no cancer, no disease, we'll take all that out, right? But we'll build you a replica. And you can take her right home and you won't even know, the kids won't notice, the neighbors won't, nobody will notice. Isn't that great what modern medicine can do? And I mean, so, no, well, first look at it from the point of view of Mary. Right, so she's sitting there hearing the good news, right? So she's going to die. But you're going to be fine, right? You're going to have another Mary, a bird of exact replica. And from your point of view, what are you supposed to think? That Mary's, what happened to Mary? What happened about your love for Mary? Should you mourn her now, or should you just think, oh great, I just got another one? And when, like with my car, right? Oh, it's broke, I got a new one. There's something wrong with that, isn't there? Or the thought is, Mary has a reasonable complaint about you if you go for it. I mean, just think about it. To see that she does, just think if it goes this way, right? So what the doctor says is, yeah, well, Mary's had 2 days, she's gone. But don't worry, we have Jane, she's pretty close. Not a cell-for-cell replica, of course, but she kind of looks a bit like her, and if you put a little lipstick on her, I don't think you'll really notice that much. That's just like this, right? You go to a party with your beloved, and you see somebody on the other side of the room, and you think, okay, bye, I'm going to get a new one, right? That's a betrayal of love. And why is it a betrayal of love? Well, because love is for this person, not for somebody who's like this person. Right? So your love for yourself, too, is not your love for this sort of person. It's a love for you. And that's the hard part to capture, right? The idea that love is directed to a particular concrete individual, not to a type, recipe, sort, kind, or whatever. So you have to give these little thought experiments kind of help you to see that there's something wrong with the idea that, you know, what you like is the Mary type of person, of which it so happens that there's only one, but we could easily make some more. And you could think about it, just to push it one little step further, because you know I think, well, when we think about love or anything, really, we think about politics too, because there's a politics of love that goes along with it. So think about it this way. Think about consumerism, right, as some kind of way of thinking about the world. Consumerism encourages you to think about things as replaceable, usable, disposable things, right, that you use for a while and then you get another one, right? And our work, our consumerism, you know, the other side of it, which is kind of production, the side of the worker, so to speak, it encourages, right, doesn't just encourage, it treats workers as replaceable cogs in a wheel. So, you know, you're in cubicle A today, typing away on your little monitor, and if you get sick, they don't say, oh, he's irreplaceable, hold that cubicle, right? They say, hire someone else, right? And when you look at yourself that way, right, you see that something, well, you could spell it out like, there's nothing too particular about me. What I do, somebody else could do. If I were to die tomorrow, I'd just be replaced. Okay. Now, the one area where we think that's not so, right, is in your intimate relations with your family and beloveds, right? They don't think, oh, Dad died, let's get another one, right? Or, oh, yeah, well, you know, anybody could play the dad role, or any suitable person could. Let's just get another one to play it. So there are areas where we want to resist that way of thinking. But you might see the political pressure, or the way we're encouraged to think about each other, as pushing us towards a picture in which, even in those intimate areas, we're replaceable too. And that happens at the first step, the logical or sort of metaphysical first step, when you just think that people are tokens of types. Right? So if I can duplicate Mary, right, my beloved Mary, I can just get a cell-for-cell replica of her, why not? Well, if it were to be so, if we had the technology, that was what Blade Runner pushes on us, right, we would use it. Well, we might not, I might be too virtuous to use it, but the corporations that make these things will start making them, and they'll start getting us to want them. Yeah.
What's interesting to me is I think there's already a way in which at least elements of the intimate sphere have been encroached upon by this, like, consumerism replacement.
I agree. Yeah.
I think there's so many ways you could look at it, but like the anti-aging industry, and like specifically within all of the beauty industry, I think that's one way that even if you can't like update your wife to it. I recently watched a documentary where he was like, the husband said to his wife, when you turn 40, I'm going to trade you in for 2 20-year-olds.
Yeah.
So like, you can't do that, but like you can, buy these things, or even like the sex doll industry, which is like booming right now. Like, it's interesting how far is it going to go?
Well, I mean, basically the thought would be, it'll keep going as far as it can go as long as there's money to be made out of it. Right? So that's what a market does, right? A market says, if we can get people to want something and there's money in satisfying their wants, we should do it. Right? I mean, and if you think there are going to be objections to it or things, well, it'll work to get around those. That's just the form that things take, right? Because the impetus, the background political picture is one in which that's what makes welfare for everyone. Right? The thought is, the more money is made, the greater the GDP, the happier everybody will be. Yeah.
Well, I think about it more in terms of like Solaris.
Yeah.
That type of problem, because like in that film, right? He it's interesting because he kills off multiple times. It's like the replicant of his wife, right? But I think what that is do you love the idea of the person, or do you love the actual the physicality of it?
Well, Solaris, and that won't quite get it either, because we can replace the physicality of it too, right? We can make another physical version of it. Mm-hmm. But you're right that Solaris raises the same kind of question, because it says, when we think about home, when we think about the place we were born, the people we were born to, the family we were born into, the locale of our early life, right, and we feel nostalgia, it's for that. It's not for something like it, right? And that's the push to try to capture the particularity, while there is at the same time a pressure from all sorts of areas, right? A pressure towards thinking things are just tokens of types, right?
Yeah, I think also like a big worry I have, I guess, is that like if we are able to get to that point, is that like you might just become like stagnant, because that's what happens in the movie. Like he doesn't want to leave, right?
Yeah.
Like,
well, that's the worry. If your parents are too good, you never want to leave home. You want good enough parents, but not ones that are so good that you can't find right. You can't find anything equally good. Yeah, that's true, and there is a sort of worry, and you can see it already, by the way, in the thought of Narcissus. Right? So Narcissus is in one way the perfect Aristotelian. He doesn't love the right thing; he loves his own beauty. But if you change that, right, then, so to speak, all you want to do is look at that. There's no forward motion because you've reached the kind of omega point. You're at the sweet spot. You just want to stay there. And of course, that's exactly what Aristotle thinks, right? He says, look, it's really terrible that we want change and variety. We want, God just thinks the same thing. God is like this, right? What does God love? He loves himself, right? And insofar as he loves us, he loves his reflection of him in us. Because there's only one thing to love, and that's the best thing. There is, if love is attracted by value, remember the background thought in all of these pictures is, right, you love somebody for a reason. There's something about them that attracts you, right? And now if love is drawn by that attractor, then it's really the attractor thing that you love, right? It's that in them. And then that's something that can be in other people as well. So what we're doing is we're pushing on these pictures because they tell us this is what love is. This is what friendship is. These are the truths about it. And what we recognize is that they seem to leave something out, right? And the more you think about it, the more you see what that something is, even if it's hard to articulate. Because they encourage a picture of us, right, that is false on a number of grounds, right? So one of them is, can we replace the object of love? And then the other is, once we're at that point, we think, you can't in that way replace it. And we're not replaceable. That's another thought. So we have this kind of value, which Kant and Aristotle both want to say lie in our reason. But if it lies in our reason, we have the same problem all over again. We're all just bits of the same. We're all the same, right? What's valuable about you is what's valuable about me is what's valuable about you. It's what? Our rational parts. And they're all the same in all of us, right? They don't have infinite variety. They're just this little chip that does the same thing. And that seems wrong, too, right? It's the diversity of individuals that matters, not some aspect of them that's the same in everyone, or a reflection of something, or a set of values. So we're trying to work our way through that. Okay, so what do we get in our yeah, go ahead. Yep.
I'm just wondering if one of the most recent points you made contradicted something you said earlier about how we love a specific individualized form and not like a type.
Yeah.
Because if what you said about like loving someone based on being attracted to something in them means you might love the attracting thing instead of that person. Yeah. And then like when you say, like, oh, she has a type, she only dates guys who do this, then it does seem that there's like a certain transferability between people, like with a specific
and yet that's so if we go that route, right, so first we want to think of a spark or a hook. What gets the fishing line attached to the fish, right? And that can be anything. That's my thought is just what it is that will play the role of the bluefoot for the booby is not something that's very easy to script. But what in the case of the blue-footed booby, there's just one path from admiring the blue foot to the next step. It's mating. right? That's the whole point. There's not a further thing, but in us there is, right? In us there is, first of all, the growth and development of the relationship. However it started, could have started in a million different ways, right? But however it started, it now takes on a trajectory of life of its own. And then what we started by being hooked onto is not what we stay hooked onto. That may become irrelevant. It may even have been a kind of an illusion, right? It may not have been something that you really cared all that much about, or that the other person still has. You may have misperceived it. It really doesn't matter, right? What matters is what happened, what the next course of and sets of things are. So what we want to be able to do is, first of all, give a proper role to what Plato says is the beautiful, right, that we see, or for Kierkegaard, the image of God that's reflected, or for Kant, for Aristotle, the virtuous other that attracts us. We want to be able to say, there is something that plays that role, but that's not what we stay attached to, right? It's not that what hooks us is what keeps us in the game. There's more. And then we want to be able to tell ourselves a story about that. Yeah?
I was actually just thinking about that exactly a little bit earlier. And I think you could make a case that usually when someone says, oh, I have a type, or I like redheads, or I like this, usually they're talking about sexual attraction versus romantic attraction. If someone says something like, oh, I like people who are honest, I feel like that might be more of like a trait that comes for like a bit of a deeper connection and less of a... Yeah,
although all of these are traits, though, right?
That's true.
And they fail to, I mean, so for example, think of the way that, say, Facebook or Match.com or one of these things encourages us to portray ourselves when we're kind of in the market for another person. We want to say, and I use the term, right, in the market for, right? So we're thinking of how do I present myself so that somebody else is going to want me? And then I want to think about how do I specify some of the things that I want in another person? And these are typically a bunch of things. They're not all about physical beauty or body types or any of that stuff, but there's usually a whole big load of other shared interests, shared values, a whole big bunch of stuff can go into the profile. There's also typically a photograph, right, which sends far more information than you might think, and about that too, people spend a lot of time tweaking and getting their image to look a certain way because they think, oh, this will attract others. But so call that, if you like, the kind of blueness of the booby's foot, right? This is the stuff that we think will start. If nobody ever talks to you or comes close to you, right, you can't start a relationship. So you want something, right, that gets you close. And you might think, well, that's the kind of role that something like blue-footedness plays, right? I know the kind of thing that other people want. I know the kind of thing that I want to, let's start there. But, typically what happens is, right, after a few meetings, either you just don't want to meet anymore because there's no, as we say, chemistry, or despite that, even if the profile is false, right, even if what you think is, you don't look anything like your profile picture, or, gee, you said you were interested in, physics, but you've never taken a physics course, you don't seem to know any physics, or whatever it is, right, pick your favorite thing. But that may not matter. If there is, as we say, chemistry. And what I think we want to do is to indicate that when we start talking about chemistry, we're actually thinking about something that's a little inchoate, we don't know exactly what it is, and moreover that it can take on a whole lot of it. But it's got something to do with felt attractiveness, and that makes you want to go on in some way, even if you're not quite sure where you're going or what it is you're doing. So you want to have two thoughts, right? One is there's got to be something like the blue-footedness. It needn't be the same for everyone, right? But if your blue-footedness is too weird, you're likely not to find anybody attracted to it, right? That's, you've got the same, the blue-footed boobies have the same problem, right? The problem is, I've got to get you in the same room with me so we can start to get to know one another. If I present you with things that don't attract you, that's not going to happen. But we shouldn't confuse the lure with the rest of the relationship. Right? In us, it's not. It is, in part, biologically a prelude to mating, but for us, it needn't be. Right? We may not be planning on mating at all, or certainly not on reproducing, but we'll still be able to latch into this kind of structure. Okay, so can we back off now for a sec again? Just go back to Aristotle. Right? So he thinks, okay, there is bad self-love and good self-love. Why? Well, because you can love something in yourself that's not really valuable. And love should be proportionate to value. So if you're better than I am, I should love you more than I love myself, because my lovers should be attracted to value, not to me, right? And the good kind of love, the good kind of friendship, is value attracted. It's attracted to the thing that's worth loving. Okay? That's the picture. So good self-love involves loving the rational part of yourself. And then Aristotle says, and isn't that great? Because look, the more of that kind of self-love there is, the more of the love of the rational part and loving the virtuous part, the better everything goes for everybody. Because if we were all virtuous and just and fair-minded and so forth, and eager to do the just and the right thing more than anything else, nobody would complain about that. That would be the ideal circumstance, right? And that's in a way, too, what lies behind the idea that love of your neighbor and love of God are the central Christian doctrines. The thought is, if that's what drives everything that you do, then things will go really well in the world, right? Why? Because love is attached to the good. So when you get the love built up more, there's far more good orientation, and we're far more working towards achieving the good. So so part of this is love. Love is for value and is a response to value. And the more the value is there, the bigger the love is. Okay? So that's the background picture that is operating. And so what we want to do now, I think, is spend a little bit of time trying to deconstruct it. And then what we'll do when we're working through parts of those confusions is we'll be trying to develop an alternative picture. Right? So we've got this nice picture going from Plato and Aristotle, very dominant, very much part of the background theory that I think a lot of people find themselves having. We want to make sure we understand it, and then we'll try to develop an alternative, and at the same time we'll come to understand it better as we see how to develop that alternative. So let me I'm going to take a step into the wild for a second. So we're going to take a leap and put a few pieces on the table that are there inchoately, but I will try to kind of develop them a little. So the love is a response to value, and we want to look at the value. And what we hear in a lot of these stories is its rational value, whatever that is. Right? So the thought is, the rational part of ourselves, the part that contemplates God in Aristotle, that contemplates the good or the beautiful in Plato, that part of us, that rational part of us, right, that's the locus of value in us. Right? So if you like, what's really valuable about us is that we're reflections of God. What's really valuable about us is that we've got a rational part. What's really valuable about us is that we can be moral because we do have a rational part. All that body of ideas. So I think one of the questions to have is, what's rational value? What is this? What's so valuable about that kind of value? This is the kind of question that Nietzsche likes to ask, right? I see we've got all these values, but what's the value of them? That is, right? What makes these things valuable? That's another way to put it. And Nietzsche is very hard-nosed about this, and the thought is there are lots of lots of things masquerade as values, but when you push on them, you realize that they're not very valuable at all. Yeah.
Isn't it kind of convenient that philosophers who spend all their time contemplating the world are the ones who are saying that it's the contemplative self that's most valuable?
Yeah. Well, not too surprisingly, maybe you might think, yeah. No, I think that's right. That's one of the things you might worry about. You might think that the people who write books about these kinds of things are the kinds of people who do a lot of contemplating and thinking, right? And lo and behold, what do those represent as what's really good in these books? Well, people like them, right? Rational thinking, right? That sort of thing. And there's some truth in that, I think. So one of the things that happened in the 20th century, and reflecting on these things, was when we started doing psychoanalysis, when Freud entered the scene, and Freud's daughter, especially in this case, is there's a kind of, you might say, a defense, a way that intellectuals have, or these kinds of people, thinkers have, of dealing with the world. Right? It's a style of dealing with the world. And what do? They turn everything into an intellectual problem. Why? Well, because that's what they're good at. Right? So it's a bit like economists who see everything as an economic problem. If you've got a hammer, everything is a nail. That's the sort of thought, right? So, that's right. And one of the things that we want to do is to see, even though we're thinking too, right? We want to see by reflecting on how they do it, right? What they presuppose that we shouldn't take on board. But you're absolutely right. There's a feeling far more than I think was true in the ancient world, that reasoners don't just get to have the high ground for free. And it was like, oh, reason, that's great. So if you're doing that, that's fine. No, we think, as Nietzsche would say, what's the value of that exactly? What are you telling me is really valuable? And that's a very good question. Right? We should push it and ask about it. Yeah, so that's kind of right. So one thing that rational value embodies is, there are many other things, but non-contradiction. That turns out to be a quintessential rational value. So if you contradict yourself, that's really bad. Right? So if you believe that it's raining and that it's not raining, you're out of the rationality stakes. You want to get a toehold in the rational, don't contradict yourself. Think of Socrates, right? Asking questions, trying to elicit contradictory answers. I know, right? And then saying, right, okay, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the duality that I have been presented before is that there's this feud between philosophy and poetry.
Yeah.
And like the great counter to that is women saying like I contain multitudes. I contradict myself very well.
Well, yes. Well, it's the hobgoblin of small minds, right? I'm large, I contain multitudes is the sort of thought that, the sort of thought that what? And that's one of the problems for the other side, in part because when we contradict ourselves, when we see the contradiction, we do recognize there's something the matter. So there is a built-in repugnance to the idea of believing falsehoods, right? Those kinds of things. But you're quite right. What we want to do is ask ourselves some questions about this, not just, right, I agree that the opposing picture is, I'm large, I contain multitudes, but we want to understand how that's a response, right? How does that help? Right? How do you, by getting bigger, how do you absorb contradiction? So you with me so far? So if you look, we can think about how this gets spun out again. I don't know many of you know much about Kant, but in Kant, that's the sort of thought, the noumenal self, the moral self, right? The part that's really good, the part that does all the good stuff. That's the part that avoids contradiction. And he thinks that you can get all of morality out of avoiding contradiction, as long as you understand contradiction correctly. And what I want to do is, now is just raise some questions about it. Yeah.
I was thinking about Kant when you were talking about the Blade Runner problem?
Yeah.
Because it seems like, I mean, his theory is in the universalization of moral maxims. So it's like, for instance, if you tried to universalize, like, you know, creating a clone of this person, it seems like you would contradict yourself because everyone dies. So like if everyone dies, then everyone's going to feel that unhappy kind of jealous feeling if everyone created a clone of each other when they died.
But maybe the thought would be it's the jealous feelings that are wrong, right, and that we shouldn't have them. Right? We should rather think clones are perfectly good. If they're rational, cool, right? So why think that you're so special? Right? For Kant, right, there's a pressure towards thinking you are very special, but what's really special about you is your rational individuality. And when we try to ask ourselves, what is this rational individuality that we've got that makes us valuable so that we should be treated as ends in ourselves, not means to ends, it's very much like this. Listen, your little tabernacle of the Holy Spirit, you're a little mirror of God. That's what makes you a valuable individual. And then you have to think, oh, I see, okay, but somehow my individuality seems to have been excluded at the very same time. I'm made valuable by reflecting. So you see how the response would go to the Blade Runner case. So let's reflect for a little bit on non-contradiction. So remember that all of these people that we're looking at wrote and thought before the beginning of the 20th century. And though that's no surprise, a lot happened in the 20th century. And you know, some major world wars go on, yeah. But so there was some really bad stuff that happened. But there are also some remarkable changes in our worldview. They are comparable to the changes that occurred in the Copernican revolution. So you know, once upon a time, we thought that the world, the Earth, was the center of the universe, and that really everything was looking at it, right? We're so important. Here we are, and God is looking down on us too. We're at the heart of things. Then we discover that no, we're not at the heart of anything. You know, we're just floating around in a rather minor constellation, right? There are millions and millions of them, millions and millions. Right? There's lots of other things out there, and we're not at the center of things, cosmically. Next up was to discover that, you know, we're not even very special beings, right? Because we're actually evolved like every other. That was the Darwinian revolution, which we're still fighting. I mean, it's not as if everybody's Darwinian. In fact, there's still a kind of fight. Maybe we shouldn't be learning it in school. We should be learning something else, or learn something else as well. But Darwin hasn't just occupied the hearts and minds of all of us in the way that Copernicus did, right? Nobody, well, there are people who think the Earth is flat. Flat Earth Society still has members. But then there are people who think that the Jews are responsible for the bad weather, so, you know, come on. Maybe there's some of the same people in both groups. I think the Earth is flat, and the Jews are responsible for the bad weather.
It's an interesting Venn diagram.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, but leave the crazies out. Copernicus is one, right? Most people don't think that the spacecraft photographs of the stellar are all fake news, right? They actually do think they're real and that we did land on the moon and all that sort of stuff. Okay. But a lot of things happened in areas of thinking that are less instantly accessible to us and that don't make the news in quite the same way. And some of those have to do with this view that reason requires non-contradiction. And these mostly took place in mathematics. So 20th century mathematics was a huge area. So mathematics just bloomed in the 20th century and suddenly took on an immense importance that only parts of it perhaps would have before. Well, the calculus in the 18th century, Leibniz and Newton, helped us to get a mathematical grip on motion. So before that, we couldn't really represent movement, especially acceleration in mathematics, but then the calculus enabled us to do that. So that was very important. There were various other developments, but in the 20th century, there were enormous changes, which led to the computer revolution and a whole lot of other things. All of this required immense changes in mathematics. So let's put on I don't know how much mathematics you know, and I'm not going to presuppose that you know very much. I'm not going to do any proofs. But let's take another notion, infinity. And not related, but not directly to non-contradiction, but that's another area. So, for example, infinity before the 20th century, infinity just seemed to be one thing, right? That was the infinite. There was just one kind of infinity. But the great German mathematician Cantor, you can Google him if you want. Cantor developed set theory, and he was able to prove, and the proof is actually very simple. I almost feel like going through it, but I won't. Which is that there are different orders of infinity. So, for example, take the natural numbers. Right. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Take those natural numbers, and ask yourself this question. Are there as many odd as even numbers? You might think, sure, there are infinite number of both. Right? But suppose I put the odd and the even together. Is that bigger or smaller than the odd? So here are all the odd ones. Here are all the odd and the even ones. Which is bigger?
The odd and even.
I don't know.
You think the odd and even? Yeah, I don't know is a good answer. Yeah. You might think odd and even are bigger, but actually they're the same size.
Oh, that's right, because they go to infinity.
Yeah, well, they're the same size. You can put them in one-to-one correspondence with each other. Yeah.
Oh, God.
What?
Some infinities are bigger than other
What?
infinities.
Well, but not these ones. So these, if you take these, no matter what you do with these, just by expanding them, right? You just stay at the same size. And you can actually prove that. But now let's take another one. Let's take the real numbers, the infinite decimals. So these are the natural numbers. But they're also the reals. And the reals are roughly the infinite decimals. So, for example, pi. That's an unending decimal. So the decimal expansion of pi never finishes. So take all those, and now ask yourself, are there more reals than natural numbers? And what Cantor proved was, well, he used the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph 0, to be how many natural numbers there are. Right? So call that the number of the natural numbers. That's the first transfinite cardinal number, Aleph 0. Right? That one. Clearly it was part of the same Jewish conspiracy that gave us that letter. So what he proved is that this one is 2 to the power of Aleph 0. That is, it's bigger. That's the power set of the natural numbers. So you raise it's
But if they both go to infinity, how is...
they're bigger and bigger infinities. And actually, these are very small. The Aleph 0 is a very small infinity. This one is quite a bit bigger. The proof is very straightforward, by the way, but as I said, I won't. You can keep going up by power set. So, 2 to the power of 2 is 4, right? 2 to the power of 3 is 8, right? And you keep, right, so power set gets bigger. So these are the first. So there's Aleph 0, Aleph 1. So 2 to the power of Aleph 0 is Aleph 1, and you just keep going. You can get bigger and bigger and bigger, and when you get all the way up to, well, the next biggest ones, right? Where you collect all the infinite numbers together. Then you take a power set of those, it gets really big. So what Cantor did was to show that infinity had a mathematical structure that allowed us to talk about degrees of infinity, kinds of infinity, sorts of infinity, bigness of infinity. And he did a whole lot of really exciting proofs and theorems of this. Right? So that was very, very important. It said, you see, infinity is mathematizable. We can actually think about it. We don't just have to say, there's finite and infinite, and that's the end. No, there are very, very much there are lots of different kinds of finite, infinite power. Okay, so that was very important. Next one, so there's infinity, then another one, chaos. Chaos seemed to be the very thing that mathematics couldn't get a hold on, right? Well, mathematics is all about order and structure, right? Isn't it? So how could you get a handle on chaos? Chaos just got to be off the scope, right? So Benoit Mandelbrot, does that name mean anything to you? You know what a Mandelbrot set is? Or you should look it up. Can't, right. I think it's DLE, it might be DL, I think it's Mandelbrot. And if you look up this guy, you'll find out that what he did was he gave us mathematical tools that enabled us to deal with chaotic systems, systems that don't seem to have any regularity to them at all. Right? Huge. Right? Now chaos became something mathematizable, something we could actually do theories of. That's very important. All these things, by the way, though they might seem very esoteric, all of them have real application in computer theory. So I'll give you one more, and then we'll call it a day on the mathematical stuff. So here's Cantor, Mandelbrot. Now there's something that the invention of computers enabled us to think about, which was, all right, so maybe we know that a certain kind of function in mathematics is computable. That is, there's a way to work out to do the math, do the sum. I just got it. Is there a way to produce the result? Okay. We know we can prove that this one has an answer, so there's a way to get it. But, right, what we can do in computer science is ask, is it real-world calculable? That is, could we, in a finite amount of time, reach the conclusion? That it can be reached, that's true. But can we reach it in a finite amount of time? So the difference between computable functions, that is, ones that in theory have outcomes, and actually computable one, or real-world computable ones, in which we can actually compute them using the fastest computers we've got. We do a lot of proofs about computability, right? So another one of those. Now we've got on the one hand, in theory, you can look all this stuff up. In theory, in practice. And here the person you might want to add is Alonzo Church's theorem. Now these guys, really big names in 20th century mathematics, there are a lot of others too. And perhaps the most famous of all of them is this one. Kurt Gödel. Gödel's theorem. Boy, you guys, you're, how as we say, innumerate, right? The mathematical equivalent of illiterate. No, so that's fine though. You'll start, ignorance is, once you recognize it, becomes a seed to change it, right? So what Kurt Gödel did was this. He said, take a very simple system, a very simple, just simple arithmetic. The simplest mathematical theory there is, take simple arithmetic. That's
like 1 + 1.
Exactly. It's just, it's multiplication It's addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication on the natural numbers. It's so elementary, we all learn it in school, right? It's very simple. That's what it is. And he asked himself this question. Okay. Is there a way to produce a set of axioms for it? That is, a few simple rules such that if you follow them, you reach all and only true arithmetic results. Can I get a nice little set of rules such that I can prove about it that if you follow these, you'll never contradict yourself arithmetically, right? You'll always reach truths from truths. Be great. Sounds like it should be able, we ought to be able to do it. In fact, there was a huge group of mathematicians in Germany who spent a great deal of time trying to find that set of rules, and I wanted to prove, so meta-mathematics it was called, this will find it, right? Great. What Gödel proved is that you could prove, he gave the proof, that no such set of rules exist. That's the first incompleteness did. It's an amazing piece of work. And elementary discussions of it give you the flavor of how he did it. You won't follow all the details, but you'll be able to get a kind of rough idea of how he did it. But what he proved is, notice, you couldn't prove this, that if you follow these rules, you won't contradict yourself in arithmetic. You'll never be caught by Socrates, who says, wait a minute, you said, right? But that commits you to 2 is equal to 3. And that is a contradiction, right? Well, that would be the idea. So imagine that instead of talking about philosophy, we're doing arithmetic. And our Socrates, not the philosopher, but the mathematician, who says, gotcha. Right? Wouldn't it be nice if there would be no way to get you because you follow the rules and you never reach the contradiction? Right? One second. So what Gödel proved is, you couldn't even do that for simple arithmetic. So now, let's go to reasoning, which includes simple arithmetic, of course, but is much bigger. Right? We reason far more richly, right, than we do in ordinary simple arithmetic. We do arithmetic reasoning, but we do geometric reasoning. We do all kinds of reasoning that have that are much more complicated than arithmetic. So we can't even produce the rules for simple arithmetic. We sure as hell can't produce them for reasoning in general. That is, there is no way to ensure that your rational values are rational. Why? Because there's no way to ensure that they're non-contradictory. In general, you can't do it, right? You've got lots and lots of beliefs, lots and lots of things you do. There's no way to do this. Let me sit back from all of those. Let me make sure that I'm following the right rules for reasoning. I know these are the right rules for reasoning because I can prove they won't lead to a contradiction. No. So what all of these do, right, is they attack not from ethics or from aesthetics or from what we're doing, but from mathematics, they attack the traditional notion of rational value. They say, you can't be sure you've got it. So the idea that Kant is in the background of Plato, Aristotle, and Kant about reason turns out to be, lo and behold, controversial, right? And indeed, more than that, controvertible. Go ahead.
I just gotta think there's so like, for example, so there's like no rules for these things.
Yeah.
Where do these things come from?
Well, don't think that's a good question. Never mind where they came from. We've got them, right? We're able to do a whole lot of things. The point is that picture of reasoning is wrong. Not that we don't reason, not that there's not better and worse reasoning. After all, these mathematical theories are pieces of reasoning too. It's not like we can say, oh, all reasoning is awful. It's that reasoning can't be thought of as, right, focused on the notion of non-contradiction that can then be guaranteed to be met, right? You will never contradict yourself. Rather, what we have to do is come up with a new model of reasoning, which is a big part of what all this led to. New ways of thinking about what it is to be rational, given that these old ways don't work. Yeah.
I watched a Herzog film and there's this great line that
Which are Herzog.